Welcome to Voices for Peace and Conservation. Join us in listening to inspiring stories from people who are working to save nature while also promoting peace, from the plains of northern Kenya to international conference rooms in Switzerland. Our guests will help us answer the question, how do we take care of nature and live in peace? My name is Hester Grunewald, and I have worked on peace and conflict issues for many years. I will be your host for this podcast on behalf of 4 organizations who work on conservation and peace. They are Conservation International, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, PeaceNexus Foundation, and the Worldwide Fund for Nature, Germany. Our collective experience has convinced us that we need to work together much more closely as peacebuilding and conservation practitioners. Whether we are researchers, policymakers, or activists, we all have a part to play. But how do we do this? And what lessons can we learn from each other's work? Over the course of the coming episodes, we'll be exploring these questions with our guests. For more information, have a look at the podcast description notes. Voices for Peace and Conservation is produced by Impact with Joy. And now, enjoy the podcast. Welcome to the 4th episode of Voices for Peace and Conservation. In today's episode, we'll take a closer look at the link between nature conservation and peacebuilding in Colombia. We will hear from Isabela Roque, whose life story is an illustration of how closely nature conservation, conflict, and peace are connected. Isabela will tell us more about what it means to contribute to peacebuilding in post-conflict Colombia through nature conservation, and the challenges of saving Colombia's mega biodiversity in the aftermath of armed conflict. We will also hear from WWF about its joint work with the Colombian government to strengthen long-term peacebuilding through inclusive conservation. We start with Isabela, a young woman who actively fought in Colombia's armed conflict. During her years with the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, also known as the FARC, she spent most of her time in one of Colombia's most important natural settings, Sierra de la Macarena National Park. The park is strategically located where 3 of Colombia's most important ecosystems converge, the Andes, the Orinoquia, and the Amazon. Even during the war, Isabela became interested in nature conservation, and she has continued this work in the very same regions where she lived as a combatant. So let's hear from Isabela herself.
Yo nací en Bogotá, en barrio popular de Usaquén.
I was born in Bogotá in a working-class neighborhood in the northeast of the city called Usaquén. I'm the daughter of a single mother who belongs to a family of very strong women. My family was not very close to politics, let alone to the left, but it did hold strong Christian and humanist principles, such as solidarity and love for others. As a child at school, I was already curious about problems related to social inequalities. When I turned 18, I learned about the FARC guerrilla group, but it was not until 2004, when I was studying at a public university in Bogotá, that I became an active member of the organization and left the city to live with my fellow combatants in the mountainous regions of Colombia.
Estuve en la serranía.
I spent most of my time in La Macarena during my years in the guerrilla organization, except for some periods in which I lived in Guaviare and Sumapaz. I arrived in La Macarena in 2009 and stayed there for several years. In the guerrilla group, I was in charge of supplying different types of provisions for my comrades. So I spent a lot of time walking through the serranía, through the rolling hills of La Macarena, seeing the impressive natural resources of the serranía, which people always talk about. We walked the serranía from top to bottom and encountered all kinds of wild animals like the jaguar, for example. Those encounters were really beautiful and emotional and hard to describe. Or, for example, feeling the rain at night while laying on a bed made of dry leaves and sticks and waking up there surrounded by nature. It was not like camping for pleasure as young people do now. It was more like feeling, this is my home. To feel the serranía as one's home, like saying, there is the living room, and my living room is the ecosystem. In La Macarena, I always felt surrounded by water, pure water. For us, it was very important, obviously, to always have access to water. This made our sense of belonging even stronger. It was like feeling part of the place we called home. We had different ways of interacting with ecosystems in La Macarena. For example, from the perspective of war, La Macarena was our hideout because we lived in its mountains and found shelter in its trees. The trees help us hide from others. We use them as a shield in a way. We started to promote the conservation of trees and the vegetation among local communities. Because in the countryside, people think that they need to cut down all trees in order to plant their crops. Cutting down trees is also a local practice linked to settling of people in new areas. People are knocking down the forest, planting crops, and creating cattle pastures. So we started to mitigate this activity by talking and explaining to communities why they should not cut down trees and why it is important to conserve and take care of the forest. In this way, we managed to reduce logging over the years, talking to communities, convincing them that it is not good to cut down trees, and telling them that if they did cut down trees, it should be a maximum of 1 hectare and for their own food crops. In those years, I also participated in activities for water conservation and better waste management, explaining to local communities why they shouldn't throw garbage into creeks since waste contaminates water, and we all need water for life. Many of the conservation practices promoted and imposed by us were later adopted by the farmer organizations and community councils. They also began making their own rules. The more people cut down trees, the bigger the damage, especially because people slash and burn without any consideration. Local communities live in constant danger because of uncontrolled fires. When it burns, the fire goes through the bush trails, reaches entire villages, and even destroys people's houses. Fire is a huge risk in La Macarena, and although everyone is ready to help extinguish it, we all know it happens as a result of slash and burn practices. Climate change is also a major problem. At the beginning of the year, when it is summer in La Serranía, the sun is always extremely hot, but it is getting hotter due to climate change, which makes the problem with fire even worse. There are so many elements involved in the problem of deforestation. Among these elements is the environmental conflict. Since the peace agreement is not being implemented, there is no optimal land, no social investment, and no technical investment in some rural areas, areas neighboring the Serranía. This situation makes people clear the mountains with the same old mentality of clear cutting to plant crops, sometimes even illicit ones. It is not the case in general, but let's just say that coca is what generates incomes. Of course, I am not advocating for or legitimizing it, but it is a reality. There are also external actors who intend to appropriate land there and grow that business. That is precisely one of the elements. I think that the solution or the crux of the matter is that people should be guaranteed alternatives to live without having to arm themselves in the agricultural frontier. That is, to understand that there are protected areas where there are already people in surrounding areas and even in the interior. So I think that the solution is, of course, to generate other alternatives such as community ecotourism processes where the beauty of the serranía can be known and contemplated, but under the management of the same communities that inhabit the territory. They are a population that can protect the area if they are guaranteed certain standards concerning their quality of life. For example, in the case of the savannas of Yari in the south of Macarena, there is a very nice process carried out by communities that have a clear objective, protecting the jaguar, and by doing so, guaranteeing that there's no more clear cutting. Because the jaguar needs the jungle, it goes out to the pastures and eats the cows because it doesn't have the mountains or the jungle. So I think that there has been awareness in that case. In the case of other regions near the Serranía, I know that there is also a very valuable history of caring for natural resources and for nature. I know that people value nature, that they have protected 40% of the trees on their farms. But the culture of cattle ranching has also had an impact. Sometimes they don't have other possibilities. I don't know if it is because they lack awareness or rather they need technical training for non-extensive and more sustainable cattle ranching. People also think that they need large pastures to have their cows, so I think that this has an impact on their actions. But in general, I think that communities do love the reserve and La Macarena and have a sense of belonging, if you will. But it is influenced by many things. It's not easy, but I believe that having signed the peace agreement gives us great courage and the commitment to comply with what was agreed and continue striving in the territory so that the agreement's contents are fulfilled, which relate not only to access to land, but also to the guarantees needed to achieve a dignified life, good living, and our protection, to be able to really think about food sovereignty, optimal conditions, and quality of life for all, not only for our species, but for biodiversity in general. We must feel part of the whole. We are not isolated individuals. We are not isolated societies. We are not isolated cities or towns. We are a whole. We are part of nature. We are part of the earth, of the territory. And to that extent, if we continue to clear cut, the ice at the poles will thaw. Nature will continue to lose its balance, and different disasters will continue to occur. But since we are so inwardly focused, we don't see all these events because it is the survival of life. It is life. Not only human life is life. Every time a species disappears, it affects an ecosystem, and this has consequences. I believe that we have to think about the proportions and the dimensions of this issue. Currently, I am a signatory of peace since 2016, and in recent years, I have been working in political affairs in matters related to the FARC party's activism for peace building and the struggle for the implementation of the agreement. The approaches on which I work the most are environmental issues and the struggle for women's rights. I am currently also working in the National Peace Council on aspects concerning the reconciliation of memory and truth.
Isabela has set out so clearly the challenges that communities in Colombia face after this armed conflict, especially with regards to key issues such as access to land, which has been one of the root causes of violence and conflict in Colombia and is also essential for lasting conservation. With these challenges in mind, WWF works in Colombia to promote an inclusive conservation approach that respects the rights and voices of indigenous peoples and of local communities. So, to find out more about WWF's work and its approach, we've invited Julia Gorricho to our podcast. She is the South America project manager at WWF Germany. And being Colombian herself, she works on different conservation projects in Colombia and also elsewhere in the region. So, hi, Julia, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Hesta. Very happy to be here today.
Great. Now, I know that you are very passionate about conservation and safeguarding nature in war-affected places in particular. And of course, this is close to your heart when it comes to your home country, to Colombia. So I'm keen to know, what are your reflections on Isabela's story?
Thank you, Hesta. Indeed, bringing together conservation and peacebuilding has been at the center of my professional career. So I think the story of Isabela is a really good example of the challenges of conserving Colombia's mega biodiversity in times of post-conflict and also what we faced during the war. And one of the most important aspects of our work at WWF is to try not only to conserve this biodiversity, but also to support the government of Colombia in building peace. And specifically, one of the things we have been focusing is on how to protect better our national parks and solve the land conflicts that they are facing at the moment. One of the things that we saw with Isabela's story is that the really chaotic and problems the national parks such as Macarena are facing. And our approach to that is to bring the local communities into biodiversity conservation, improve their living conditions, but also strengthen the conservation of these really nice and key ecosystems.
So it's really trying to do a lot of things at the same time, which sounds very promising. What was one of the more important steps towards this positive shift in your view? And what do you think needs to be done in addition in future to keep doing this integrated work?
So, as you know, in 2016, Colombia signed the peace agreement that was much awaited and needed, and it basically turned the page for a new Colombia and a new way of living in Colombia. This allows people like Isabela and many others to keep and start focusing on how to conserve the biodiversity we have in a more peaceful way. So with the peace agreement, I think it's important to say that the new generation of Colombians, such as Isabela and myself, we have a big challenge in front of us, which is basically how to build a country at peace with itself, but also how to promote sustainable development and conservation in a more equitable way. And this has to be done not only bringing and integrating the really forgotten regions in Colombia that have been impacted by armed conflict, but also trying to build communities that are able to conserve biodiversity and to understand that in many ways that the future of Colombia and a peaceful Colombia depends on the sustainable use and conservation of our biodiversity. So in my view, basically, Colombia's biodiversity is the key to a lasting peace.
That's a very powerful argument. And what is so special about WWF's approach in particular in trying to promote this view of biodiversity and peace?
Well, as you know, according to official data, in Colombia right now we have 59 national parks, and at least 37 have small landless farmers living in them or using the natural resources of these national parks. These farmers are in vulnerable conditions. They have been victims of the armed conflict, and their livelihoods today are different types of economic activities, such as cattle ranching or even illicit coca crops, which are one of the major drivers for deforestation in Colombia. So basically, WWF has been in the country for more than 25 years, which means that we have been working in this really conflict and violent context for a long time. And from our experience, we know that it's really important to adopt an inclusive approach to conservation to resolve these types of land conflicts in specifically these violent settings. And by that, what I mean is an approach that takes into account and respects the voices of indigenous peoples and local communities, such as these farmers that live in the national parks, and that aimed at meaningfully empower them for active participation in quite challenging political context. This, from our experience as well, conservation approach offers a very unique opportunity to rebuild social fabric in these regions that have been affected by armed conflict and violence. So it's not only about how to conserve nature, but also take care of that social context. And also, one of the most important tools we use for that is to promote this structure and inclusive dialogue between the different stakeholders that are present in this territory. And last but not least, it is also what we have seen in Colombia, that when we take this approach to conservation, it also represents a unique opportunity to nature conservation organizations like us, WWF, to take a more active role in peace building, which, as you know, is not our main mission, but it should be part when we work in this context.
That's great, and there's really so much to take away from the different angles that you and Isabela have presented in this episode, because we've heard how Isabela saw the need to work with communities on protecting nature, but is also now involved in this conservation after the peace agreement. And it's very clear from both of your perspectives that Colombia's post-conflict future really depends on the protection of its biodiversity. And so I hope that this is also an interesting example for all our listeners of how to do peaceful conflict resolution and conservation through dialogue, all at the same time, all in an integrated process. So thank you very much for that, Julia.
Thank you for having me, Hesta.
This episode's content was provided by WWF as part of the Parks and Peace project that is supported by the International Climate Initiative of the German Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation, Building and Nuclear Safety. WWF is an independent conservation organization active in nearly 100 countries, working to create a world where nature and people can thrive. Like all other partners of this podcast, WWF sees the need to strengthen integrated conservation and peacebuilding efforts, especially in some of the world's most biodiverse and conflict-affected places. I hope that you've enjoyed this episode and will join me in the next one, where we will explore the particular roles that women play in conservation and peacebuilding. Make sure to sign up or follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or any other platform where you usually enjoy your podcasts. Thank you very much for listening. Have a great day and see you next time.